Welcome to Catholic Discovery 101. My name is Liz Johnson. I'm a parishioner with Holy Spirit Catholic Community. Our program is dedicated to sharing our Catholic faith with our friends and neighbors in the Pocatello-Chubbuck community. And our guest today is Dr. Susan Swetnam. Susan is the author of My Best Teachers Were Saints. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the book, and if you join us next month, we're going to get into some specifics about saints. Susan, thank you for joining
You're
us
welcome,
today.
Liz.
So let's begin with learning a little bit about you.
Sure.
Okay. Let's start with, where did you grow up and about your early family life?
I grew up in the northern suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and lived there until I graduated from high school. And my family was Presbyterian. I grew up as a Presbyterian until being a very serious teenager. I decided that that church was not serious enough for me. And this was the mid-'60s, so it was social justice things. I thought that my own particular congregation and my minister was just not very interested in things that really mattered. And so when I was about 16, I stopped going to church and didn't go again until I was in my 30s.
Okay.
But it was a different church that time. So I don't know, my father was an accountant, my mother was a housewife. I'm the oldest of 4 children.
Okay. So what about your professional life? Tell us a little bit about that.
When I left home in 1968, I went to the University of Delaware and did an undergraduate English major and did a year of high school teaching, and that was sufficient for me to do. I really admire high school teachers who stick it out, but that was plenty for me. So then I went back to graduate school at Delaware and did a master's in English, and was a teaching assistant and taught a lot during that time, and did a master's thesis on Melville and was really excited, and then went directly to PhD school, to graduate school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and was there for roughly 4 years, and I was a Rackham Scholar and worked in narrative history, narrative theory, especially the history of the novel, and my dissertation was on a contemporary writer named Thomas Pynchon, but had lots of roots in earlier stuff.
Okay. So what about, you were Presbyterian, that's how you were raised. What brought you to Catholicism?
Well, I was here as an assistant professor of English I came in 1979.
In Pocatello?
Yeah, this was my first job out of graduate school and the only one I've ever needed. It was a perfect fit. I met my husband here. Everything was just absolutely terrific, and has been for a long time. I came in '79, and about 3 or 4 years later, I was going through kind of a rough patch. And one of my friends, who was also, actually she was a graduate student, took me to St. Anthony's one night, or asked me to meet her at St. Anthony's, that's right, for Mass. And, I thought, what the heck? And I'd always thought the Catholic Church was kind of attractive because of the ritual and how serious it was. Again, right, this is the kid who wants Uber, and only I was really sorry that the Masses weren't in Latin. That's what a purist I was as a kid. But I went to St. Anthony, and my friend actually, who had a young son, something came up with her son, and she couldn't go. So I found myself sitting toward the back of the church by myself, not knowing, what to do. But I was in the middle of the row, and I thought, well, let's just see I didn't have anything better to do, so I thought, let's just see what happens. And I'll never forget how at the wishing of peace, of course, I didn't know anything about the scripting and what was going to happen. I was just kind of sitting there letting it flow around me, and I was really as I said, in a rough place. And the woman next to me, a complete stranger, turned to me and wished me peace, and I thought, how did she know? Right? It was out of nowhere, and it was this amazing moment where I thought, wow, there's something going on here. These people really know. And I always think of that when I wish a stranger peace, now. And I realized that this is just what you do, right? But that night it seemed like this miraculous insight on somebody else's part. And so and I liked the music a lot, and I liked the ritual, and so I kind of kept going. And then after Ford and I married in '85, I just kept going. And a couple of years after we married, I converted. I figured it was time to stop fooling around. And Joe De Silva was the priest at the campus parish and at St. John's. And he, in those days, formation was a little less formal than it is now. And so Joe and I just had all these conversations, and he's such an intellectual, and he's so wonderful, and it just kind of grew from there. And so I joined the church. Gosh, it's just terrible to say. I can't remember exactly when. It would have been about 88 or something like that. And my sweet late husband was God's own agnostic. I mean, a man of sort of serious reverence and curiosity who just couldn't quite get over the church history. He was raised Episcopalian, but he was very serious. And he was actually, some of his poetry appeared in a book called Pacific Northwest Spiritual Poetry, even though he was a self-proclaimed agnostic. But the funny thing is that he'd always been with Catholic women, and so he marries me, and 3 years later I become Catholic. So that's kind of the story.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
I always love to hear people's stories of conversion and how it impacts them. And so often they wander into a Catholic church and they are struck by the ritual, that there's just a rhythm, a cadence to it that's just,
there is, yes.
that it's calming, it's soothing.
Yes.
That's what I find when I'm troubled or when I was away from the church and came back. That was very calming.
Well, the other thing that really hooked me, and this remains the big hook to this day, is the whole idea of reconciliation. Because I was raised Presbyterian USA, so they weren't right-wing evangelical Protestants, but there was still this sense that screwing up and doing things wrong kind of meant that you weren't there, and that when you were saved and when you were really where you should be, you weren't going to screw up anymore. That's what I thought as an adolescent. Now the whole idea of original sin and Calvinism, I mean, how could I think that? But that's what I thought when I was a kid. And but the thing about the Catholic Church is that the assumption that people are flawed and they're going to keep making mistakes, and that's just human nature. And if you get reconciled and do your best, it's okay the stumbling is just part of the assumption about human nature. And that seems to me one of the wisest things. And the fact that it's built into the sacraments is stunningly appealing to me.
It is. And there's a lot of people that can't get over, why do I need to confess my sins to some man? And as you study the Catholic faith and you realize the priest is sitting in place of Jesus. And you're really talking to God when you're asking for forgiveness. It's just that we all, some of us need that human touch to say, it's okay, I forgive you.
Yeah.
It's such a wonderful feeling.
Well, partly because it's so hard to forgive ourselves.
That's
right?
true.
And but when the priest forgives you, or the priest acting as Christ forgives you, you have to take a big, deep breath and say, okay, that really happened. But it's hard sometimes, for me at least, to convince myself that
it is.
It is. I've been forgiven.
Yes,
so
you've been
it's
forgiven.
really wise, I think, for the church.
Yeah. I hear that a lot with the women at the prison. The hardest person for them to forgive is themselves, because they let not only themselves down, their family, their friends, sometimes their employer, and they really have a hard time with that.
Yes, yes.
And they talk freely about that, and that inability to let go. And to know that God loves us no matter what. So let's talk a little bit more about your life at the university here. What did you teach here, and for how long?
I taught for 35 years. As I said, it was the only job I ever needed. I retired 2 years ago, and so I taught in the English department. And my field is narrative history and theory, and I did a lot of that. When I first came, I was interested in the history of the novel, but the resources here for scholars were not going to support that as a main research interest. So I ended up working in Western narrative, because when I got here, there had been very little serious work done in Western American literature. And so I worked a lot with Idaho writers, and especially and Western women writers. But I also did a lot. I sort of evolved as a creative writer, which is another thing I do, into working with creative nonfiction, with especially narrative nonfiction. And so my first book was about pioneer autobiographies and biographies written by Latter-day Saints about their pioneer ancestors. It was a cultural narrative study. And nobody had ever looked at that outside the church, and it was really fun. And one thing led to another, and I've just done all kinds of things over the years. But I've also done a lot of pedagogy. I've taught the new TAs a lot in the department, and I've directed the writing program, I think 3 or 4 separate times. I can't remember I was director of composition 3 or 4 separate times, and so I've done a lot of TA supervision and talking about teaching with people over the years. And I've taught many writing classes: advanced creative writing, magazine writing, which I taught last spring just as a one-off. Lots of basic composition, tech writing. I've done lots and lots of teaching of writing, and I've done a lot of administration too. I was never department chair, but I was director of graduate studies and undergraduate studies and chair of the faculty senate and chair of the general education committee. And I also have done, the other part of this is that I've also done a lot of work for the Idaho Humanities Council. I've been chair, and I've been a board member, and I've done lots of projects as a project director and as a supervisor.
Now, when you retired from the university, you didn't really retire.
Tell me about it.
You now have your second career?
Tell me about it. Well, there's the first career kind of hanging on. This is the first semester I haven't taught a class. They've been down in numbers and they've needed me. So I've been teaching one class every semester, and I have 3 graduate students still working with me. And they may not finish till I'm 90, so that's ongoing. I also, as a writer, I wanted to write after I finished, and rededicate myself to that. But I'm a widow, and the idea of living at home and being, by myself writing 8 hours a day isn't going to happen. I mean, nobody can do that. So I was thinking about more human contact. So when my husband had cancer, a wonderful neighbor, Grace Jacobson, taught me to do therapeutic touch on him. And it really seemed to help him. Therapeutic touch is where you don't actually touch people, but you kind of sense their energy field and calm them that way. And so she taught me to do that, and it looked like I was okay at it. And then after Ford died, my back seized up, or while Ford was dying, and it was so bad that if I would bend over to put my contact lenses in, I couldn't straighten up. It was horrible. And so I had to do something. And so I went to a massage therapist who didn't know anything about bereavement massage, but knew how to use her elbow. And she got my back working again. But the other thing was that while she was working on me, those were the only times I ever cried after Ford died, just about, is on the massage table. So when I was thinking about what can I do that'll give me human contact and be interesting and challenging, I thought, well, what about massage therapy, especially for bereaved and caregivers and hospice patients and things like that. So the last couple years I worked, I took a class a year to prepare. I took kinesiology and anatomy and physiology and that kind of stuff. And then the year after I retired, I was in the certificate program at ISU, the massage therapy certificate program, full-time, and got my certificate a year ago, July, and opened my own practice. So now it's called Balsam Root Massage, and I'm working, I have lots of general clients, but I'm also doing a lot of hospice work and home health care work. I'm working for one of the hospice groups in town, and a couple of days a month. And I also this summer got a certificate in manual lymph drainage, which is reducing edema, swelling. It's a very gentle, very technical discipline for reducing edema and dealing with lymphedema. So I can work with cancer patients. And I have a couple already that I'm working with, and I'm really looking forward to doing more of that.
That must be really helpful, knowing that you lost your husband to cancer and to be able to help somebody else who might be suffering.
Yeah, well, it's really wonderful because not just that, but I think that when you go through it with somebody this is very frank, but I think when you go through it with somebody you love and the person dies, the worst has already happened. So I've actually done some deathbed massage, and I find it incredibly inspiring. And working with people in the last months of their lives, very inspiring. And people say, aren't you afraid? Isn't it scary? How could you do that? And it's not scary, right? I saw the person I love most in the world die very peacefully, but and it's so wonderful to be able to touch people, literally, who are in those stages, and give them hopefully some comfort. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. We could do a whole other program on that. But let's get back to the book. Yeah. So what prompted you to write this book?
So after Ford died, I was in a state for about 3 or 4 years. I mean, in a serious state, as people often are. But the word pathological grief was thrown around by various shrinks in town. But it was awful. And I was teaching, and I had to figure out some way to focus myself. In the morning, I'd get up, and I couldn't even remember what classes I was teaching that day. And I'd be so scattered, and I was alone in my house. And so I've always been kind of interested in the saints. And, I thought, well, they were people who suffered horribly, right? And they had horrible, miserable lives, and yet they got up and did it again, amen, as Jackson Browne said, right? They got up and did something useful. So I thought, okay, I'm going to read all these gory, horrible stories about people who suffered, and by comparison, what happened to me won't look so bad. And maybe that'll give me the sand to get up and do what I have to do today. So I started reading them. And of course, and just by good luck, a hardbound copy of Alban Butler's Lives of the Saints, which is one of the canonical texts about the saints, showed up in a local secondhand bookstore. And I found it, right? So there's something going on here. So I started reading the Saints of the Day every morning when I got up before I went to work. And what I quickly discovered was, yes, some of them had gory, horrible lives, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them were really kind of ordinary, regular people. And B, I would think of them a lot as I went about my day, about the people I'd read about that morning. And so often, something that happened with them was kind of startlingly opposite to what had happened to me, right? And so I was making these connections, and I'm also a frustrated homilist, right? I mean, so often I'll hear a homily in church, at Mass, and think, oh, I would have done something different with that text, right? So right at the end of the most desperate period, I got a writer's residency to a group in Washington State. I had a sabbatical. Awarded me a writer's residency. So I was on the Washington coast, being sponsored and having, in a beautiful house near the ocean, having time to write. And of course I had a project I took with me, and I was working on that. But when you're doing something like that, often other ideas seem a lot more interesting. So around the edges of my main project, I was sending out a lot of query letters for kind of gleam in the eye projects. And so I thought, well, what about a book about the saints? For teachers, right? Because that was how a lot of the relevance was that. And so I wrote a query letter about a book of meditations on the saints for teachers, just, kind of for fun, took me a couple of days, and sent it to Loyola Press. And so all of a sudden, there's a note from my housemate. I went out for a walk on the beach, and there's a note from my housemate on my desk. This is only like a month later. And it said, Loyola Press wants you to call. So here I am surrounded by other writers, and all of a sudden I've got this book contract, right, a very nice contract, with a press that really believes in me. And the trouble was, being me, I said, of course I can do this. I'll get it to you by about a year. And then I realized I'd contracted to write 52 biography essay pairs in a year, and that involved a lot of research. So I spent the next year basically possessed by the saints. Every time I had all weekends or trips or anything I could steal, I would go someplace and do research. I would write. It was insane. I mean, as I say, I had saints in the belfry that year. It was crazy. But the book got in on time, of course, because I'm me. And it was marvelous working with the press. And then it came out in 2006. So that's how it happened. It was sort of like one thing leads to another. It was so marvelous.
That's great. So in your book, one thing that struck me as I was reading it is, there's a saint part, there's saintliness, but you also showed their humanness. why did you think that that was so important? Because it comes across in every single chapter that
and
you
that's
wrote.
very deliberate. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, technically, I mean, theologically, saints aren't different kinds of critters than we are. Saints are people who walk before, who show the way. They're not perfect people, right? They're different. They're different in degree, not in kind.
Okay.
Than we are. And so by suggesting that some saints might have little quirks, right, or even have had flaws, right, this is not something that goes against basic Catholic teaching. Okay.
They're human.
They're human. They're humans that found a way to transform their humanness into some kind of transcendent modeling for us of what it might mean to be holy. Right, and so if you're just thinking abstractly for a while before I get to the utility of that, if we're looking to mentors who are different, so completely different than we are, right, that are already perfect, they're not going to be very good mentors because we know we could never be like that because we're not perfect. So, in the sense of saints as examples marching before us, if they were these little China angels, they wouldn't be very good mentors, right? You need somebody who's going to say, "Oh, that happened to me," or "Oh, I remember feeling like that," or whatever. But in terms of the book itself, for teachers, I think that it's easy to get discouraged if you're a teacher. And it's easy to get nervous, it's easy to doubt yourself, it's easy to get frustrated, it's easy to get short with your students, it's easier to get in wars with your colleagues. All those things happen if you're a teacher, probably to just about everybody, I would guess. And understanding, it's sort of like what I was saying about reconciliation earlier, right? Understanding that these things are going to happen, and they even happen to the people who we look up to the most, right? To the saints, right? People who are supposed to be sitting with Christ, interceding for us, right? That those people went through analogous things, right? Is, I think, a much more approachable sort of inspiration. That because the saints, I mean, the saints that I love the most are saints, many of the saints I love the most, are saints who had, at some point in their life, exactly the sort of quirks that I have, and managed to find a way to be saintly instead of them.
Instead of that.
In spite of that, rather.
That's one of the things that I was struck by, how often you talked about a saint's life, and then when you went into the meditation about that saint's life, something that happened to you that brought you back to that saint and how they would have handled it.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't want to do this, but I need to do this.
That's right.
To help.
That's right.
To help.
That's right. Well, it's a sense of a higher purpose, right? It's a sense of vocation, really, with a little v, right? that as a teacher, there are ways that I've said this once or twice in the book. The way that you can sometimes be God's hands, right? That you can sometimes be a force working in the world, and just because you can't do that 24/7 because you're human, doesn't mean you can't do it sometimes. Right. And I've seen over the years so many young teachers who make one kind of big mistake in the classroom and completely lose heart and confidence, right? And people who are talking about walking away because they know they can't do it, that sort of perfectionism that people have often at the beginning of their careers. And to be able to say, look it, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to get up and brush yourself off and remember why you're doing this and try it again is huge. And I had mentors who did that for me. So
it's good to pay it forward.
Yeah, that's
mentality.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Good heavens. Yeah. Yes.
So let's talk about saints in your own life.
Okay.
As a teacher, who's your favorite saint?
Well, it's teacher, but it's sort of my broader career where I've also been an administrator and a committee leader and somebody who mentors and supervises other people. And there are a lot. One answer to that is, what day is it? Right, and what day was it, and what am I going through today? Because that's the nice thing about there's so many of them that there's one for just about every dilemma, and the book is actually built around dilemmas. There's a saint there's a saint for each dilemma for many dilemmas that teachers can face. But just for me personally, one good candidate for the most influential would be Teresa of Avila. because she did so many things, and her life was all about sort of competing demands for her, and competing roles she had to play, and balancing them, and balancing her own sort of fiery and outspoken nature. And there's so many ways to identify with her for me.
Not only as a teacher, but
not only
just
as a teacher, but as someone who was also well, she was the first woman ever doctor of the church. So she's a scholar, and but she's also a mystic. So she had a serious her own serious interior prayer life, and she was a writer. And so she had she needed time to fulfill that creative side and meditative and scholarly side, if I can say it with quotes around, a side of herself, but her own work. Right, her own interior work as a creative being. And yet she was also the mother of an order that she founded, right? So she had supervisory responsibilities. She also had to work with young women who had just entered the order. So she was a teacher of them. And some of them were good and some of them were not so good. And she had to figure out ways to kind of get them on the right path. And she got frustrated with some of them, right? At one point she said, "God save us from stupid nuns." And every time I've blown up at or said something snide about one of my colleagues or students, I always think of that, right? Teresa, okay, not that you want to say that, but Teresa, even Teresa could say things like that. And along with that, she also had to sort of be a go-between between her order and the powers that were, and and this was Inquisition times, right? So she's treading very fine thin lines, and so she had to be a politician too. And at various times simultaneously in my career, I had to do all those things. And so the sense of, oh man, how can you ever handle responsibilities that are this varied, was so helpful to me.
So she really was a teacher in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Is there another saint that you have a preference for?
Well, personally, Elizabeth Seton is my patron, because she was widowed, much younger than I was, but widowed before her time. And she was also an educated woman, and a woman who could have lived comfortably just sort of after her husband died. And instead, she found a completely new vocation for herself and rededicated herself to a broader sort of meaning of life. And she deeply loved her husband, and she was flattened after he died. And at the same time, she managed to pick herself up and dust herself off. She actually converted to Catholicism and founded a school, one of the first significant Catholic school in the United States, and an order of teaching sisters, and was again a teacher and a supervisor, and somebody who always lived with her own grief and her own sense of, why did this happen to me? Why me? And yet managed to make a really productive life. So as a widow, she's definitely my patron.
To step away from that, why me, and what do you want me to do?
Yeah, I mean, the question is not, you could never know why me. The question is, what next? Okay, if this has to be, what are we doing?
What am I going to
do with this?
Where are you sending me?
Yep.
Our time is at an end. If you enjoyed this, we're going to talk about specific saints next month. So please tune in for that again. We air on Sundays at 6 and Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. Thank you. In closing, I ask God to look with favor upon each and every one of us. Thank you for joining.